I don't know where the light switches are, but it would work. Okay, if you can take your seats, we'll get started here. Good morning. Welcome to day 3. Good things happen on the third day, right? It's good to see that we are risen. It is absolutely my pleasure to introduce our first speaker this morning. I have the great pleasure of being a neighbor, very close neighbor to her daughter, Tessa Caldecott, who those of you who attended the conference last year would have heard speak. But our speaker this morning is Leonie Caldecott. She's a writer who lives, according to her name badge, in Hobbiton, England. She started out as a featured journalist. She was the winner of the Catherine Peckham Award for young Catholic women or young women journalists. She also won the Catholic Women of the Year prize. She worked for many years in writing and publishing in the area of faith and culture, having founded, along with her late husband, the great Stratford Caldecott Second Spring. And they do have a table downstairs. If you haven't checked it out yet, please do go visit the table in the vendor hall. Leonie is the author of several full-length plays. She just finished writing her first novel, which centers on a community pub. And I think that might enter a little bit, that thematicity will enter a little bit into her talk this morning. Please join me in welcoming Leonie Caldecott.
Good morning. Good morning, America. Like my daughter Teresa last year, I suggest you adjust your headset so that you can hear the translation of my talk. I know you just had breakfast and it's still early in the day, and I'm simply the warm-up act for Joseph Pierce, so relax. It's Saturday morning and you're listening to the Brit Spot. In spite of the fact that I'm going to talk about inns and pubs, there will be no pub jokes this year. There might be a pub story, but she said public pub joke last year. That's in spite of the fact that I've just flown in from Ireland, where, as you may know, the venerable institution we call the public house has its most ancient roots. I have this on good authority from none other than Kenneth Branagh, whose film, Belfast, it is said, "Sure, the Irish are always after leaving. How else would the world have known about pubs?" Appropriately enough, I'm going to talk about G.K. Chesterton's novel, The Flying Inn. You may think I've selected this because it's his pub novel, though it could have more to do with my current fear of flying. I don't know about you, but in this anxious age, my principal thought when I'm in the air is, when are we going to land? Which is one reason for flying with Aer Lingus, because there's nothing quite so reassuring as an Irish voice over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're cruising at a height of 40,000 feet, and if you look down, you might spot the Mariana Trench. Don't let this worry you. We'll be coming into Philadelphia in a few hours now. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the selection of inaudible films we've selected for you. And then there's the stewardesses, who address you as dear when they offer you tea. A proper tea, not that cabbage water you get in some places, and you can stand your little wooden stick up in it, so you can. But Chesterton, of course, loved the Irish, not to mention their pubs. He understood their charm and their tragedy, and he sympathised with their historical plight. He also loved Americans, of course, a sentiment my late husband shared. He spent his gap year here. For those of you who don't know what a gap year is, it involves travelling to some wild foreign country before you begin college, and then returning with your horizons expanded and a greater appreciation of your own place. Which is, of course, a Chestertonian meme. Now, we actually honeymooned here in 1977 and came back many times to work on a series of somewhat balmy writing projects, which I won't go into. One time we overstayed our welcome and managed to have a baby here, which is a truly balmy thing to do. You know her, of course, our eldest daughter, Teresa, named after the great saint of Avila, who is famous for comparing the rigors of a Christian life to a night in a bad inn. See what I did there? By now your breakfast is soaking up last night's hangover and you're all ready to hear about the flying in and whatever else I'm going to throw into the pot before young Joe here starts tapping his watch and giving me the Glaswegian handshake. But the flying in is one of the lesser-known works in the Chestertonian canon, and I noticed that Kingsley Amis, in an essay on GKC's novels, which is part of an excellent 1974 centenary collection, leaves it out entirely. So I suppose that makes me the wee woman filling in for the insufficiencies of Kingsley Amis. Literary joke. Never mind the 2 acres, check out the cow. Published on the eve of the First World War, close on the heels of his play Magic, the flying in is in some ways what the Irish might call a banjaxed vehicle. Banjaxed, meaning damaged, is one of my favourite Irish words. I'll use it a lot. By this, I mean it's unevenly loaded with didactic asides, at least by modern standards. Didacticism, the habit of stuffing paragraphs with the foie gras of moral purpose, can be the kiss of death for a novel. Yet, in his contribution to that 1974 collection I just mentioned, the late, great Ian Boyd, with his usual acuity, defended Chesterton against this ground for dismissal, because, he said, Chesterton's fiction is a special form in its own right, the allegorical form. And indeed, said Father Boyd, it's the allegorical quality of the novels that prevents them from being political pantomime and gives them their real subtlety of perspective. To be honest with you, assessing GKC's literary worth is probably a task beyond my capacity. I'm more interested in getting behind the toy theatre's proscenium and taking a look at the puppeteer. Why is he writing this story? And what does it tell us about him? And more importantly, what does it tell us about his relationship with that greater creative genius whose image he bears and whose DNA courses through his inky blood? John Henry Newman once hazarded the view that scribblers of tales are not good candidates for canonization, referring to himself. Look how that one ended. Watch out, GKC, they'll be hoisting you onto the altars sooner than you think. In truth, we are all people of the word. It's what distinguishes the human race from other creatures. Our words may reach our listeners, or they may fall by the wayside. But it will be easier to hear what someone has to say if their art captivates our heart, if their voice, that carrier of the word, reminds us of another voice, a voice we have faith in, a friend's voice. Now, the Chestertonian voice can sometimes come over like a gleeful schoolboy having a bit too much fun at the expense of things he doesn't sympathize with. But he is also the conjurer of a deeper, more satisfying type of humor. It's hard to render what I mean by this because it's always hard to put something holy into words without flattening it. It has something to do, I think, with a divine paradox. The upside-down act of having, at the pinnacle of earthly creation, placed like a clown-red cherry that banjaxed creature we call man. If Tolkien felt that publishing The Lord of the Rings was exposing his heart to be shot at, then Chesterton's fiction may in some way be exposing his soul to be gasped at. At its best, his art is interesting for the simple fact that through it we actually catch a glimpse of an unusually rich spiritual life. So the premise of The Flying Inn is a dystopian vision of a future England in which alcohol has been banned. GKC was actually writing 7 years before prohibition actually happened here in the USA. The drink, and thus the establishments that serve it, have been suppressed at the behest of a powerful political faction led by a universalist vegetarian named Lord Ivywood. Chestertonian names are always shot through with significance, and when I was writing this, I was gazing at a beautiful oak tree on the other side of my garden wall, which is literally covered in ivy. To the uninformed eye, ivy is a very elegant plant, but it is invasive, and an excess of it can be deadly to the health of even a great and well-rooted tree. And from Chesterton's description of Lord Ivywood, it is clear what he represents. Just to give a brief example, Lord Ivywood had an admirable command of temper, which had helped him much in his career as a statesman. At any rate, Ivywood seems to have been inspired by a pseudo-Muslim sage who we first meet preaching on the beach at Pebblewick-on-Sea. This may be one of GKC's more childish bits of characterization, hovering somewhere between Madame Blavatsky and Charlie Chaplin. So I'm not going to dwell on him, but the important characters in the novel are the two men who attempt to save the last pub in England, the Old Ship. They do this by literally taking a barrel of rum on the run. A huge wheel of cheese also figures in the equation. Keep that cheese in mind, since the sub-sacramental species of this allegorical story come under two forms. The mild-mannered landlord of the Old Ship, Humphrey Pump, is described by Father Boyd as a complete expression of what Chesterton meant by the common man. He is joined by the most appealing character in the entire novel, a huge, red-haired naval captain called Patrick Dalroy, who is, of course, Irish. While the publican keeps his now illegal public house rolling along those English roads, it is his Irish sidekick who is its most eloquent and vocal champion. Witness his sales spiel to their very first customer, served under the ensign of the Flying Inn, an unsuspecting old man. Lord Ivywood, I'm not going to try and do the accent because it'll fail in the middle of the reading, so I'm not going to skip it, said Dalroy, setting the rum cask with a bump on the plain deal table, wishes to take wine with you, or more strictly speaking, rum. Don't you run away, my friend, with any of these stories about Lord Ivywood being opposed to drink. 3-bottle Ivywood, we call him in the kitchen. But it must be rum. Nothing but rum for the Ivywoods. Wine may be a mocker, he was saying the other day, and I particularly noted the phrasing, which seemed to be very happy, even for his lordship. He was standing at the top of the steps, and I stopped cleaning them to take a note of it. Wine may be a mocker. Strong drink may be raging, but nowhere in the sacred pages will you find one word of censure of the sweeter spirit sacred to them that go down to the sea in ships. No tongue of priest and prophet was ever lifted to break the sacred silence of Holy Writ about rum. He then explained to me, went on Dalroy, signing to Pump to tap the cask, according to his own technical secret, that the great tip for avoiding any bad results that a bottle or two of rum might have on young and inexperienced people was to eat cheese with it, particularly this kind of cheese that I have here. I've forgotten its name. Cheddar, said Pump quite gravely. But mind you, continued the captain almost ferociously, shaking his big finger in warning at the aged man, mind you, no bread with the cheese. All the devastating ruin wrought by the cheese and the once happy homes in this country have been due to the reckless and insane experiment of eating bread with it. You'll get no bread from me, my friend. Indeed, Lord Ivywood has given directions that the allusion to this ignorant and depraved habit shall be eliminated from the Lord's Prayer. Have a drink. Note the Eucharistic allusions from a writer who is yet to enter the Roman Catholic Church. And then later in the story, a donkey is commandeered to keep the rum and cheese on the road until the sheer geographical scope of the plot, not to mention animal welfare, necessitates switching out Brother Ass for a motor car, though the image of the donkey and cart is the one that always stays with you. A comparison with Don Quixote suggests itself, pointing to that more developed novel of Chesterton's later years, The Return of Don Quixote. And so it is that the flying in remains in quixotic flight around the beleaguered landscape of a supposedly dry England, planting its ensign like the flag of St. George wherever the conspirators pause in their travels. The repartee between them affords some amusement pertinent to us here today. Pump, to Dalroy. It seems to me, Captain, you aren't quite fair to these foreign chaps. Take these Americans now. There were many Americans went by Pebblewick, you may suppose, but in all the lot there was never a bad lot. Never a nasty American, nor a stupid American, nor, well, never an American that I didn't rather like. I know, said Dalroy, you mean there was never an American who did not appreciate the old ship. I suppose I mean that, answered the innkeeper, and somehow I feel the old ship might appreciate the American too. You English are an extraordinary lot, said the Irishman, with a sudden and sombre quietude. I sometimes feel you may pull through after all. Dalroy is forever cocking a snook at their pursuivants, justifying the existence of the pub with a sparring talent worthy of Portia's in The Merchant of Venice. Witness this scene where Ivywood has just succeeded in tightening the law even further to try and prevent the monkey business he has become wise to. The words inserted by the recent act, said Lord Ivywood with the cold courtesy of the conqueror, are to the effect that alcohol cannot be sold even under a lawful sign, unless alcoholic liquors have been kept for 3 days on the premises. Captain Dalroy, that cask of yours has not, I think, been 3 days on these premises. I command you to seal it up and take it away. Surely, said Patrick with an innocent air, the best remedy would be to wait until it has been 3 days on the premises. We might all get to know each other better. And there you have it, the genius of the Chestertonian genre. Yes, it's a legitimate genre, divine comedy with solemn intent. At the heart of the comedy is this question, how indeed might we all get to know each other better? Or to echo Joe Grabowski in his talk to us yesterday, how might we get to know our neighbours better and get entangled with their lives? And there, of course, is where the public house becomes what I think of as a sub-Eucharistic locus in terms of fiction. William Blake said something interesting in this connection. A good local pub, he said, has much in common with a church, except that a pub is warmer and there's more conversation. Of course, Blake wasn't thinking about the interior conversation, but we'll leave that to one side. Even if you take flying in as a religious allegory, the whole narrative is not so much about a sacred space as about a pilgrimage in search of such a space. You might even call it a pilgrimage of grace. Reformation, Puritan, Nietzschean forces against Catholic sacramental human ones, core Chestertonian stuff. Pump and Dalroy are effectively apostles going out in pairs, healing the sick and bringing the good news to sinners, and above all, not taking a purse. At one point, Dalroy gets around the ban on the sale of alcohol by simply giving it away. At another point, the pair take up residence in a pharmacy where you're technically allowed to dispense alcohol for medicinal purposes. And then there's the poet, Dorian Wimpole, whose car they have borrowed and who is left with the donkey instead, which heals him of his existential malaise, so that's okay. And in a scene in an art gallery, it is quite a confusing plot, where Ivywood is displaying his preference for the abstract form. Of course, he prefers the abstract to the figurative, go figure. Dorian challenges the grandee with the ultimate philosophical defense of art's real purpose. Ivywood, having finally spelled out his Nietzschean conception of both art and man with the revelatory words, "I deny that any limit is set upon living things," Dorian observes, "Then I understand why, though you make such good speeches, you have never written any poetry." The key is the capacity for poetry, and as if to demonstrate this, Dorian takes flight with some of the most famous lines ever penned by his creator. Before the Roman came to Rye, or out to Severn strode, the rolling English drunkard made the rolling English road. A rolling road that rambles round the shire, and after him the parson ran, the sexton and the squire. A merry road, a mazy road, and such as we did tread. That night we went to Birmingham by way of Beachy Head. My road, meanwhile, is going to branch into other places, times, and art forms. Poetry can be many things, epic, balladesque, or sparse and spare, and one example of this is the poetry at the heart of certain scriptural passages, such as the wedding at Cana, one of my favourites. This is in chapter 2 of St. John's Gospel. But before we remind ourselves of this theological proof that the fruit of the vine is dear to the heart of God, I am going to give you one last connecting point in the flying in, i.e. GKC's swipe at modern biblical criticism, something my husband and I were very interested in. So it comes in the form of a certain Dr. Bunk's take on the Cana narrative. Authorities as final as Pink and Tosher, wrote the professor, have now shown with an emphasis that no emancipated man is entitled to question that the aquavinic thaumaturgy at Cana is wholly inconsistent with the psychology of the master of the feast, as modern research has analysed it, and indeed with the whole Judeo-Aramaic psychology at that stage of its development, as well as being painfully incongruous with the elevated ideals of the ethical teacher in question. And there you have it. A strong motivation to get back to the text and the poetry of what is arguably the greatest piece of flash fiction ever penned. And I'll give it to you, though you know it well. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." This is a masterpiece of economy in writing terms and one of the most gnomic exchanges in all of Scripture. Even poor old Job gets more dialogue out of God than Mary does in this scene. Proof of her sanctity. It is a divine haiku worthy of unpacking, and in order to do this, I'm going to refer you not to a piece of written fiction or theology, but that most modern thing, a TV series. Now, I know none of you ever watch TV, so this is all going to be new to you. But you might watch this. It's an interesting undertaking, which is a series on the life of Christ entitled The Chosen, which comes out of America. Now, there's been a lot of debate about the theology behind it, and all sorts of things, so I'm not going to go into that. But there's one episode I do really love, and I want to home in on it, and it is treating Cana, and it's called The Wedding Gift. It opens with a finding in the temple. Mary chastises Jesus for jumping the gun by interacting prematurely with the priests and elders. And in reply, the 12-year-old asks her, "If not now, then when?" Words which Mary then repeats back to him when he hesitates in front of the requested miracle at Cana. Words which supply further motive for her intercession because they display her burning compassion, her practical friendship for the family of the groom, who are caught in a deeply shaming situation caused by their relative poverty. I wish I could go into more detail about why I think this particular episode is a work of genuine religious art, and if you haven't already watched it, it's definitely worth your time. There's so many details, the symbolism of the stone jars, what they say about them, the relationship between Peter and his wife, treading grapes together as he tells her of what is happening to him, and she endorses it. The sheer joy that Jesus and his mother bring to the wedding feast, and all of it pointing, of course, towards that which the wedding at Cana is really about, the wedding feast of the Lamb, the Eucharist, which is connected so dramatically with the mainspring of this gospel, the tension between revelation and suffering, with the friendship of Christ at its core. I actually think that GKC might have been a little excited to see this passion-packed narrative play out on the screens of the world in the midst of a supposedly atheistic age. Now might be a good time to confess that I was advised to stick to literature rather than film to illustrate my theme. The trouble is, there are two cinematic works that seem to me to express the Chestertonian spirit for our own time rather well. Also, I don't want to simply be taking coals to Newcastle, as we say in my country. So I'm going to lean very weakly on the fact that in the same year as The Flying In was published, GKC himself participated briefly in the history of cinema. It seems he appeared in a silent cowboy movie produced by none other than J.M. Barrie, author of Peter Pan. I kid you not, he and a couple of friends cavorted around Essex in chaps and cowboy hats, lassoing ponies and being rolled about in barrels. Presumably the rum had been drained out. I owe all this delicious detail, along with much else, to Joseph Pierce's book, Wisdom and Innocence. If you haven't got a copy of that, go and buy it straight away. The movie was never completed, unsurprisingly, and I don't know if anyone still has the footage, but boy, would I give something to see it. So, to the cinema we shall now repair. The first film, I think, our Gilbert would have rather enjoyed, gathers people not in a pub, but in a private home, which on a particularly cold winter's night functions just like a warm inn. That film is another one you might have seen. It's called Babette's Feast. It was directed by Gabriel Axel and was released in 1987, based on the 1958 Isaac Tennyson story. It tells the story of two sisters, daughters of a Protestant pastor on the remote coast of Jutland in the 19th century. It's in Denmark. In their youth, the sisters were courted, one by a Swedish cavalry officer and the other by a famous baritone from the Paris Opera. But their father rejected the suitors, so the two spinsters live on beyond their father and preside themselves over the dwindling congregation he left behind. One day, a French woman called Babette comes to their door with nothing but the clothes on her back after fleeing counter-revolutionary bloodshed in Paris. Turns out, the opera singer, Achille Papin, has sent her. The sisters take her in, and she remains with them for 14 years as their unpaid housekeeper, each day cooking the extremely plain food they are used to. Then one day she wins a large sum of money for a lottery ticket. She decides to spend the money on a single feast as an act of thanksgiving to the sisters and to their community. Of course, at first they resist the idea, but after accepting in order not to offend her, are scandalized by the sheer scale of the culinary nonsense that's going on in the kitchen. In the end, they decide amongst themselves they will eat the food in order to please her, but will be sure not to take any pleasure in it. Chesterton would have enjoyed this absurd dissociation, I think. As the feast unfolds, with the serving of course after course around a softly lit table, accompanied by the wines that Babette has sent for from France, along with the other ingredients, a strange transformation comes over the assembled company. Discord amongst the congregation begins to dissolve, and a spirit of gentle friendship, and I think we can safely call it agape, begins to reign. Then Martina's former suitor, the aged General Löwenheim, who has returned to the sisters' house for this one evening, gives a toast. This is what he says: "Man in his weakness and short-sightedness believes that he must make choices in this life. He trembles at the risk he takes. We do know fear, but our choice is of no importance. There comes a time when our eyes are opened and we come to realize that mercy is infinite. We need only await it with confidence and receive it with gratitude. Mercy imposes no conditions, and lo, everything we have chosen has been granted to us, and everything we rejected has also been granted. Yes, we get back even what we rejected, for mercy and truth are met together. Righteousness and bliss shall kiss one another." course, this is based on Psalm 85, love and faithfulness meet together, righteousness and peace kiss each other, which ends with the beautiful line, the Lord will indeed give what is good, and our land will yield its harvest. I love that psalm. Obviously, this is much more than a simple toast. It's almost Chestertonian toast, I would say, a rapturous canticle, a chiastic break in the normal run of human discourse. If it offers a glimpse of heaven. On a worldly level, Babette's gesture is indeed a shocking waste, and that is what makes it a Eucharistic allegory, because she has poured out everything she had. The praise that Achille Papin once heaped on Philippa's beautiful singing voice, Philippa now passes on to Babette. Oh, how you will enchant the angels. As the other guests make their way home, they hold hands round the village well and sing one of the old songs taught to them by their pastor. They are a little drunk, for sure, but it is not the work of human hands which transforms them. On this night, in Hec Nocta, this little Christian community might have drunk from the Grail itself, for Christ has asked them the essential question, what ails you? So before I go on to my final example, let's just go back for a minute to the basic premise of what a public house actually is, and to one of Chesterton's many assessments of that. In his wonderful essay, If I Only Had One Sermon to Preach, published in the collection entitled The Common Man, Chesterton posits that it's only in a pub that a certain experiment can be carried out, which is proving that the common man has a better sense of theology than anyone else. For the sin that he abhors more than anything else is the one he expresses in this pithy phrase. He comes in here and he thinks he's God Almighty. Then, continues Chesterton, the scientific inquirer will shut his notebook with a snap and retire from the scene, possibly after paying for any drinks he may have consumed in the cause of social science. He has got what he wanted. He has been intellectually justified. The man in the pub has precisely repeated, word for word, the theological formula about Satan. In my country, the fight to keep village pubs open has taken on a whole new aspect. Where big breweries are closing down unprofitable pubs, some local communities are taking them over. In order to protect a pub from, say, a greedy developer who wants to repurpose it, they can apply to the government to have the building listed as an asset of community value. There is a famous case of a pub in the Midlands called the Crooked Inn, it is suspected was set on fire by its new owner, who had acquired it in order to repurpose the site. This caused a furore. And this brings me to a very recent film, The Old Oak, which is set around a pub at the heart of an economically depressed community in an ex-mining village in the northeast of England. The owner, TJ, lives on the edge of bankruptcy, has narrowly avoided committing suicide, and only fights to keep his dilapidated premises open in order to provide a space for the locals to call their own. Then, new people come into the town, families who are in urgent need of shelter. TJ, who is a fundamentally decent man, tries to help them. The strangers, like Babette, are deeply grateful to him and to the rest of the community, and they have several skill sets which they now try to use to show their thanks. One is an ability to cook for large groups of people, for they have many children. And they also have a talent for embroidery. They start cooking free meals for the villagers in the back room of the pub, which has been closed for years. They do this because they've found out that many families are literally having to choose between feeding their children and heating their homes. And yes, it is sometimes that bad. Everyone, or almost everyone, gets on board, and food starts to be donated from multiple sources. A team at nearby Durham Cathedral collects supplies to send to the pub, which gives rise to a very beautiful scene in that gorgeous medieval edifice, a scene between TJ and the oldest daughter of the immigrant family, a scene which all by itself would make the film worth watching. Here are the words of TJ in a voiceover as we see the project take off and everybody work on the kitchen, the pub kitchen. And I won't do the Geordie accent. This is solidarity, not charity. This is about we sit down and do something together. Not a one-off, but ongoing. I don't know if any of you will get to see this film, and be warned, it's not exactly family viewing. For starters, there's a ton of swearing in it. This is an angry and despairing working-class England, and that anger works itself out in some distressing ways. There is loss and bereavement. It's not a Disney film. It's the swan song, in fact, of a socialist director called Ken Loach, which makes it interesting to me because at its heart it seems to be an almost religious film. It's about friendship with the neighbour that God has placed in your street, even if you are not particularly warming to them, and about the grace of God touching some very bruised human hearts. It's a film about not allowing bitterness to invade your life, even when ideology or greed or war have robbed you of everything. And who are the heroes of this film, other than the beleaguered innkeeper? I have to tell you that they are Muslims, who, as their ultimate gesture of friendship, make as a gift to the village a gorgeous banner with an oak tree embroidered on it, which they will carry together on the traditional miners' procession in Durham at the end of the film. Now, returning to the wedding at Cana, it's worth asking ourselves what that best wine actually represents. To ask for this wine, to implore this spirit of generosity from the heart of God, we have to envisage its possibility. We have to put our all, as Mary did at Cana, into an intercession which unleashes the fountain of grace God wants to give us, and which could still transform our world. My late husband described this principle in one of the last things he wrote before he died, unpublished as yet. Jesus tells us in the Sermon on the Mount that only the pure in heart will see God, which is how we describe the ultimate achievement of our life's purpose. What is purity of heart? According to Kierkegaard, it is to will one thing. But it is only with God that I may achieve it. Which is to say, in the language of theology, with the help of grace. Sorry about this. The one great love is kindled in us by someone else who loves us first. We love because we have been loved. Given the occasion and the fact that it is a birthday that exceeds even that of the great adventurer, Bilbo Baggins, we should perhaps leave the last fireworks to Gilbert, because a good pub is most often about the food. It can be simple fare, not expensive gastropub stuff, as it is about the drink. I have many friends who are teetotal for various different reasons, just as I also have many friends and family who are vegetarian, so that's not really the issue. The pub should be a place that welcomes all experiences and convictions, a place where dialogue can take place, where friendships can be formed, strengthened and maintained. But I did promise you that we would come back to the question of cheese, so here it is. What an extraordinary thing, exclaimed, it says Dorian, it's not Dalroy. What an extraordinary thing, exclaimed Dorian Wimpole suddenly. Why, I'm quite comfortable. Such a thing has never happened before, I should imagine. And how holy this cheese tastes. It has gone on a pilgrimage, answered Dalroy, or rather a crusade. It's a heroic, a fighting cheese. Cheese of all cheeses. Cheeses of all the world, as my compatriots, Mr. Yeats, says to the something or other of battle. It's almost impossible that this cheese can have come out of such a coward as a cow. This is my legally blonde moment. I object. Mr. Chesterton. I suppose, he added wistfully, it wouldn't do to explain that in this case, Hump has milked the bull. That would be classed by scientists among Irish legends, those that have the Celtic glamour and all that. No, I think this cheese must have come from that dun cow of Dunsmore Heath, who had horns bigger than elephants' tusks, and who was so ferocious that one of the greatest of the old heroes of chivalry was required to do battle with it. Okay, now I'm going to try and land this thing before Lord Ivywood can intervene, muttering, "Gentlemen, all jokes come to an end. This one has gone so far as to be serious." Luckily, I am no gentleman, so perhaps I can consider myself immune to his imprecations and leave you with a wee story of my own, closing off the Caldecott family circle, which our eldest opened last year with her Franciscan pub joke. It is by stories, of course, that portals are opened into other worlds, as C.S. Lewis well knew, and I freely acknowledge my debt here to the great storyteller who influenced both Lewis and Chesterton, namely George MacDonald, one of my very favourite writers. I'm going to tell my story in a modern idiom using the present tense, for the sacrament of the present moment is, after all, the portal to the friendship of a God who resides beyond time. And here's the story. Be kind. A poet, a priest, and an academic walk into a pub. The academic asks for the cocktail list and spends an inordinate amount of time considering what ingredients in which cocktail might set off his allergies. The priest is more decisive and wisely orders a good bottle of Châteauneuf du Pape. The poet, whose profession ensures that he is possessed of slender means, goes around the pub to see what everyone else is drinking before he makes his choice. Eventually, he comes to an old woman sitting by herself in a dusty corner, nursing a pint of local ale. She is reading a hardback book with a torn and battered cover. Forgive me for intruding, says the poet, who, in spite of the dissolute company he keeps, is at heart a well-brought-up fellow. But what is it you're reading there? Wordlessly, the old woman lifts up her book and shows her interlocutor the cover, where the word flying can just about be made out. I've not heard of that one. Is it any good? Inquires the poet. Oh, says the old woman, I just found it lying around in here. My eyesight's bad and the print is small. But I like to hold it in my hands because I can tell it was written by a good man. The old woman smiles at the poet, and suddenly she appears, if not young, then ageless. He sees that her hair is red and long, like spun copper, and her eyes bright and brimmed with hope. Who are you? Asks the poet, sinking into the chair opposite her and forgetting the rest of the room. I am the little girl that a sage defended many years ago, she said, a little girl whose head was not shaved because her dignity mattered, and whose mother could comb from her hair the cares and snares of this world. And she held out her tankard to the poet and asked, would you like a taste of this warm beer, Anam Cara, my friend? Thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two questions, if you'll take them, Leonie.
Sure, I'll try.
Really not a question, but just mentioning another film that comes to mind. It's beautiful, the reflection you've given, but of Gods and Men has a beautiful scene at the table and the sharing of wine that comes to mind right in that line that you've spoken of.
I love that one, yes.
Going up, Nancy.
What is your book and when is it coming out?
Oh. So, I don't know when it will come out. I'm still working on it. You keep thinking you've got to the end of the manuscript. You're familiar with that process. And then I've just done another research trip to Ireland, which is why I was there before I came here. Discovered there's a lot of things I still need to correct and amplify and get right. So I have no idea. It's beginning to be in submission, but we'll see. It's sort of doing the rounds of agents in the UK at the moment. The title, which I am going to refuse to change, whatever anyone says to me, is The Maker's Rest.
Thank you again. Thank you. All right, everyone. We have time for a quick break, and back here at the top of the hour for Joseph Pierce. Thank you.